학생들 사이에서 선풍적인 반향을 일으켰다. 민중들의 역사 속에서 파생됐던 한국의 민주주의와 한반도 평화를 통찰했던 브루스 커밍스 교수가 올해 제정된 국왕 김대중 학술상의 첫 수상자가 됐다. 한반도 전문가이자 한국 민주주의 이론의 새로운 초석이 된 브루스 커밍스 교수에게 한국 사회의 화두를 들어본다.
안녕하십니까, 김민웅입니다. 5.18 광주 민중항쟁, 금년이 벌써 27년이 됐습니다. 세월은 많이 흘렀지만은 그러나 시간이 흐를수록 광주 민중항쟁의 역사적 의의는 더욱더 빛나고 있습니다. 많은 희생을 치루었지만은 5.18 광주 민중항쟁이 없었다면은 오늘의 한국 민주주의는 어떻게 되었을까 생각해 보게 됩니다. 되돌이켜 기억하기에는 너무나 가슴 아픈 사건이었지만은 그 이후에 우리는 바로 그것으로 해서 많은 성장을 이루었습니다. 오늘 이 자리는 광주 MBC가 마련한 브루스 커밍스 교수와의 특별 대담 시간입니다. 그동안 한반도에 있어서 매우 중요한 여러 가지 관찰과 그리고 발언을 해온 세계적인 석학을 모시고 여러분과 함께 5.18 광주 민중항쟁 27주년을 맞이해서 과연 우리는 앞으로 어떻게 나가야 될 것인지에 대한 생각을 해보는 그런 시간을 마련해 보았습니다. 도움말 주실 분, 전남대학교 5.18 연구소의 조정관 교수님도 함께 모셨습니다. 안녕하십니까?
안녕하십니까?
네, 반갑습니다. 브루스 커밍스 교수 하면은 세계적으로 한반도 문제에 대해서는 잘 알려져 있는 전문가시기도 하고요.
예,
또 우리한테도 굉장히 익숙하신 그런 분이신데, 자, 소개를 좀 해주시죠.
예, 브루스 커밍스 교수는 누가 뭐라 해도 세계의 여러 가지 연구자들 중에서 한국현대사에 관한 가장 정평 있는 석학이시고, 무엇보다도 1980년대에 한국사 연구에 대한 새로운 열의를 국내 학자들이나 국외 학자들이 낼 수 있는 그런 계기를 마련한 그 유명한 한국전쟁의 기원이라는 저서를 통해서 잘 알려져 있습니다.
네.
이분은 그 후에도 한국학에 대한 많은 제자들을 길러내셨고, 또 끊임없이 한국의 민주주의와 그리고 한미관계 등등에 대해서 연구하시고 발언해 오신 대표적인 학자라고 할 수 있겠습니다.
네, 시카고대학에 있는 브루스 커밍스 교수 모셨습니다. Welcome, Dr. Bruce Cummings.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Congratulations. You were given the award, the Kim Dae-jung Award for your academic achievement, right?
Yes, it was really a wonderful honor to me, and something that has a particular meaning in a couple of senses. Number one, I have great respect for former President Kim Dae-jung, so it's a real honor to get an academic award offered in his name.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, to my amazement, I was the first person to receive this award,
Right.
which really is
The first winner.
very humbling and also very gratifying. So I'm extremely pleased and happy about the award.
Okay. The award was given to especially the publication of the book, The Origin of the Korea War, right? It was published in 1981.
Well, it's a two-volume study, and it
Right.
was the first
one
volume
is
1981 and the second
1981.
one in 1990.
You know, when I read the book, I was in the United States. I was studying the political science at the time, and one of my friends gave the book to me. It was so inspiring to me. I was so impressed. Is this book really written by American scholar? Oh,
Thank
my
you very
God.
Thank you very much.
Why did you write the book?
Well, I came to Korea almost 40 years ago in
4 years ago.
1967. Yeah,
As
as a Peace Corps volunteer teaching English in Seoul. And frankly, I was not impressed by the nature of the Korean-American relationship. I had been led to believe that it was a very close one and allies for freedom and all of that. But I felt that many Americans had prejudiced views of Koreans. They found it very odd that I was living with a Korean family and eating Korean food and all of that. And I found it very odd that they were so, living up on compounds separated from Korea. That had a deep impact on me, frankly. It was a real turning point in my life, and I decided to probe the origins of the Korean-American
So
relationship.
that was the moment of beginning. You are becoming interested in the Korean politics and history.
Yeah, it also, of course, coincided with the Vietnam War being at its height and the civil rights movement.
So that affects your idea about the way you think about Korean politics.
Absolutely. And so I determined to study the American military government in Korea, not really having any idea.
During the 1945 and 1948.
Yeah. And I didn't really at that time have any idea that that was connected to the war. But the more I learned about it, mainly in declassified secret materials in Washington, the more I learned about it, the more I realized it did have a direct relationship to the origins of the war. So that was how my project started. I was fortunate to be the first unofficial researcher to get into the records of the American military government. It's quite, I think, an irony for Koreans because this was an American government. The official language was English. And it was in Korea, but Koreans could not see documentation higher than secret.
Yeah, after your research on the Korean War, there was a fad of scholars in Korea and outside of Korea about those documents and the declassified documents, and that way the studies about Korean War, including this period of the First Republic, like the rule by President Lee Seung-man, was wholly studied by from the wholly different perspective by the young scholars. You know, they all read your books and they were so fascinated and started to work on the declassified documents and secret documents, and we made great progress, right?
Well, I think so, but a lot of this I only was able to get indirectly because from 1972 until 1985 I couldn't get a visa to come to Korea. The only visa I got was in 1979 for 3 days.
Just 3 days.
Yeah, and I was followed around everywhere. It's so silly, following a historian, wasting Korean taxpayers' money on me. But it was very difficult for me to have much contact with Korean scholars until the Chun Doo-hwan regime ended, and then, of course, it's been. But I think it was a great honor for me to be on Chun Doo-hwan's enemy list because there were many, many books proscribed by Chun Doo-hwan, but mine was one of the only ones in English.
Wow.
I think that my book is a hidden history, primarily in the sense that for 30 years, these documents were kept hidden and kept away from scholars. But once they were available, then it becomes a general history that everybody can look at and interpret. I mean, I'm not by any means the only one having done this, but I still think that it's just an irony and that Koreans themselves could not read these documents during the military government in their own country.
Bruce, you know that your book is also very controversial, you know that. And you are one of the scholars who is most misunderstood. What can you say about this?
I feel that it's very curious for me. I became well known in Korea, especially among the 1980s generation for my first book.
Yes.
But in America, there's unfortunately not nearly enough interest in Korea. And so people in America are quite surprised that my book would be controversial about anything. I mean, Americans will say to me, I'll say to them, people run around saying that I said the South started the Korean War. And then they'll say, well, what's wrong with that? Did they or didn't they? In other words, they don't know anything about
Because of the nature of the Civil War in the United States, right?
Well, it's true. I mean, civil wars don't start. I mean, that's been my position for a long time. We don't ask who started the Vietnam War. In the case of the American Civil War, it's the fundamental issues were slavery
so
and
the question is
secession.
quite different from
well,
what we have.
It is different, but it's similar in that I've always argued that the Korean War was fundamentally a civil war. Of course, it had important international involvements, but it was fundamentally a civil war, and it started a long time before 1950. I said in my book that it really started in the 5 years before 1950. But the more I learn about the 1930s, the more I think one can say it started in the 30s, really.
Professor Cho,
Yes.
Bruce Cummings, Dr. Bruce Cummings was awarded for his academic achievement,
Yes.
especially his study on the Korean War. And the Kim Dae-jung Award appreciate the historical value of his studies. Could you tell us how the Korean Academic Society view his work?
Well, I may say that the mainstream, we can say mainstream, the mainstream of Korean scholars in the 1980s were pretty much critical about what Professor Cummings has done on the origin of the Korean War because of the ideological, prejudice and so on. And after that, what is interesting to me is in 1990 we had a dismantling of the Cold War, and historical evidences of the Russian regime has been available to historical scholars, and then there happened a fad of scholars fad of academic researches about the origin of Korean War to attack, kind of criticize what Professor Cummings has done. And then what happened was there was a strong evidence on the connection between the Stalin's intention to let Kim Il-sung to invade Korea, and that cause now got a lot of attention from Korean scholars, and some of the scholars believed what Cummings has done has been now has now become a kind of trivial in a way that they can evaluate the origin of Korean War. The origin of Korean War, especially the origin was international, they say, and then kind of they discount what Cummings has done. But I don't really disagree, and some of the pro-democratic scholars in social science, in history, believe you can have international origin, but domestic reasons for the war was pretty much strong too. So they are, in kind of controversy over this issue. Yeah.
Well, I think it's very interesting because I wrote 33 chapters in 2 volumes, about 1,500 published pages, and only in one chapter did I talk about who started the war.
Yes.
And I was really trying to get Koreans in particular to stop talking about who started the war and to see that it had multiple origins, multiple responsibility, and a very large responsibility on the part of the United States, really with an eye toward reconciliation between North and South. Because if you go on forever saying Kim Il-sung is the only person, or Stalin and Kim Il-sung are the only people responsible for the Korean War, number one, that's not true historically.
Never, I think.
And number two, it never is true.
Never is true.
And number two, it really gets in the way of trying to understand where the North Koreans are coming from, and gets in the way of reconciliation. But I would urge viewers to look at the other 32 chapters in my book, because they deal with all kinds of other things besides the fundamentally moral question of who started it. So I mean, I always thought I would not succeed in putting that question in the margins. But and then, as you say, it came back very strongly with Soviet documents coming out. But I've read a lot of those Soviet documents, and I'm of course, there are new things. Every time you get a collection of documents, there are new things. But what many of my critics don't point out or even understand is that I dealt with a huge collection of North Korean documents that were captured in the North by the Americans and released in the American archives exactly 30 years ago in 1977. I spent 2 or 3 years reading those documents until I needed bifocals. And those documents are extremely important. They fit like, the jagged edges of a broken mirror with what was going on in the South and what was going on in the North. And they show the ultimate responsibility of Kim Il-sung and his friends for taking the existing conflict, which was already quite bloody, to a new level, a level that they couldn't control, and a level that ended up destroying much of Korea. So they're entirely responsible for that. But later Soviet documents after the Korean War now show that Kim Il-sung was constantly giving all kinds of trouble to Russian leaders and telling them off and telling them he's not going to do what they want him to do. And that was the relationship I thought existed also in the 40s and 50s. So ultimately, you know, what I think is good is if people look at the Korean War from all sides, get all the documents together, try to understand it as best as possible, and then put it in the past in terms of contemporary politics.
Then we can get a complete picture.
Yes, and we can get the ideological problems out of our mind.
이제 27년이 지난 광주 현실에서 브루스 커밍스는 도대체 또 어떤 생각을 하게 될지 5.18과 관련한 이야기를 나눠보도록 하겠습니다. Bruce, is this your first visit to Gwangju?
No, it's my second visit.
When was the first one?
The first one was a long time ago in 1972.
1972.
Yeah. I visited Cholanamdo as part of my research when I was here doing dissertation work. And I was particularly interested in seeing places that were coming up in the materials I was reading, like Yeosu, Suncheon, Naju, Hampyeong, Mokpo, and of course Gwangju. I really enjoyed that visit. Koreans tended to look at me like a Martian, I think, because I didn't see another foreigner that I recognized
at that time
during the time I was here. And you know, I went into places and had you know, Naju Komdang or something like that, and they were also amazed that I would do that. So but I mean, that was quite typical at that time, 35 years ago.
Your book, the first one, The Origin of the Korean War, was published in 1981.
Right.
And the May Gwangju uprising or rebellion or democratization movement was in 1980.
Right.
Did this May uprising affect the way you wrote that book?
No, not at all, because my book came out from Princeton University Press, and they take a very long time. They go through page proofs, and then they go through copy editing.
So it was written
it was finished
before?
It was finished in 1979, and then I did all the drudgery of actually getting the book out in the open as a published book. So no, it didn't have an effect, but the Gwangju Rebellion itself had a tremendous effect on me.
When you were thinking about the relationship between the United States and Korea.
Yes, and in some ways it was a repeat of what happened in Gwangju and Cholanamdo in 1946 when there was an uprising.
You mean the similar pattern of the relationship between the United States and South Korea? Yes.
I mean, the United States supporting police in 1946 who came into one place after another, Naju, Hwasun, places like that, and shot people, killed them. And the United States actually, when you look at the documents, thought, well, this shows the police who served the Japanese can also serve us. It was a very unfortunate recognition on my part.
Bruce, you know that after Park's assassination, the people in this country expected that the United States would support the democratization movement.
Yeah.
But in fact, it was not. The United States supported the military government. And you mentioned that the United States is responsible for the massacre in Gwangju, May in 1980.
Well, I followed the situation here very closely for a year before the Gwangju uprising. I was given a 3-day visa in June 1979 only through the intervention of a friend in the Tokyo embassy. That's the only way I could get a visa. I wanted to buy books, essentially. So I came here in June 1979, and just before President Carter visited. And a student of mine at Chicago has been working in the Carter Presidential Library and has shown that up until June 1979, President Carter was really a critic of the PAC government and its human rights abuses. But during that visit, he got very angry at PAC, and his advisors like Zbigniew Brzezinski, Harold Brown, the defense secretary, and Richard Holbrooke tried to calm him down and tell him, look, we have to support this government for security reasons because of North Korea. That's very clear a year before Gwangju. Then you had disorders in Masan and Busan. You had the YH incident in August 1979 with Kim Young-sam supporting textile workers.
You remember many things.
I remember that year very well, and above all, I remember when Bach was assassinated. And then I followed events very closely, of course, after that. And you're exactly right that in the first several months of 1980, the Korean people were gathering together, talking about a new constitution,
Right.
How to achieve a democratic politics, and all of that. And I remember having arguments with people. I could see the way Chun Doo-hwan was slowly taking power, December 12th in the military, April in the KCIA. And I said, he's going to take over. And unfortunately, I
When
was
did you
right.
say that?
I said it in December, actually. You can
December?
ask Carter
After
Eckert.
December 12th.
Yeah.
Right?
You mean in 1979 you already
December.
expected that?
When I saw the coup within the military in December 12th, and the United States did nothing about it. This was a terrible breach of military discipline.
So you also expected that something, just like the Gwangju massacre would happen before
Well, no,
or
I
during
thought-
or in the process of taking over the power?
What I thought was, and I still remember this, I thought that Chun Doo-hwan was Park Chung-hee's protege, and he was going to complete the coup after taking over the military in December. And Carter Eckert he's a professor at Harvard, and at that time he was in Seattle, and he said, I said essentially, Chun Doo-hwan is going to make a coup d'etat.
I see.
And he said, oh no, that's not going to happen. Koreans will prevent it. But anyway, if it was obvious to me, it was obvious to the American government.
And then, Bruce, what is your major point of the historical reflection of this May uprising?
Well, I don't think that the massacre in Gwangju was the direct responsibility of the United States. It did not order a massacre. I'm sure American officials were very dismayed at what happened. But the U.S. was in a no-win or a situation where if it opposed the military, that's intervention in Korean politics. If it doesn't oppose the military, that is also intervention. So damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I was particularly, though, distressed that under President Carter, who was a human rights advocate, his aides and advisors were able to convince him that security was more important in Korea than coming to the aid of the people in Gwangju or doing something to punish Chun Doo-hwan. I think when you look at the documents we now have, and by the way, we have hardly any. We just have a little bit. But looking at the documents we have, it's apparent that when the U.S. released troops from the DMZ to go to Gwangju, that they knew those troops had a particularly brutal reputation. And then after they massacred people in Gwangju, Americans praised this unit.
Yes.
The American officials who were here at the time, like William Gleistein, who was the ambassador, they would always say, well, they don't really have influence over the Korean government. And that was their excuse for not acting. But in fact, they had tremendous influence. And they could have gone to Chun Doo-hwan.
In fact.
In fact, yes, in fact.
And said, if you send troops into Gwangju and you don't try to negotiate and deal with the people of Gwangju, we will pull our forces out or we will take our aid away. He would have listened and he would have obeyed, so to speak. I know this because in 1975, Park Chung-hee was developing nuclear weapons, and Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State. And he sent a cable to Park Chung-hee threatening to pull the entire American effort out Pak went forward with nuclear weapons, and Pak chose not to. So you see the U.S. does have influence, tremendous influence if it wanted to use it. I also think the really hypocritical and quite terrible thing was to say we can't do anything but support Chunduwan because the North Koreans might attack.
That's what they can do.
General
what they
pretext.
They
could
do it all the time.
They do it all
Yes.
the time, yes.
They do it all the time, but in 1980, North Korea was thoroughly deterred from attacking. The Carter administration had sent an aircraft carrier task force into Korean waters. In fact, what happened is Gwangju played into the hands of North Korea so that they could say, see, the U.S. only supports military dictatorship in Korea. It does not support the people of Korea. So it was a very badly handled and a mess, but to me it was shameful in the sense that it was kind of first-time tragedy, second-time farce. This happened in 1961 when Park Chung-hee violated the military command rules. And at that time, it was the first time this had happened in Korea for the United States. It was also a time when people argued that the military was very important for development and all of that, so that there was a kind of support growing out of that line of thinking. But in 1980, when Korea was already an industrial country and had demonstrated that it could handle any kind of democratic participation, for the U.S. to again support a militarist, it was a tragedy and a farce combined, but it was, in the sense of first-time tragedy, second-time terrible. You should be ashamed of yourself.
The role of the United States. You know that generally speaking, before 1980, the Korea was a very special pro-American society. But after Gwangju massacre, the Korean people became aware of a different aspects of the United States, its role in this international situation, and its support to the military regime in third world. So different phases of the United States become very clear.
Yeah, I mean, as an historian, I think that there always was anti-Americanism or opposition to American policies in Korea, going back to 1945. The occupation under the military government was quite raucous with a lot of demonstrations and rebellions, so that it isn't the case that Koreans always thought Americans were here to help them. After the U.S. defended South Korea in the Korean War, I think for the generation that went through that, the U.S. was very important as a kind of savior of the Republic of Korea. And then, of course, for 20 years, you had textbooks and censorship and all of that under the Pak government, so it was very hard to think anything else or to know anything else. But when you look at things outside of Korea, the U.S. in the 60s and 70s supported one military dictatorship after another. In Brazil and Argentina and Greece and Iran, not a military dictatorship, but the Shah's dictatorship, Guatemala, many examples in
So
Central
Korean
America.
was not the exception.
It wasn't the exception, and it's a very unfortunate aspect of American policy abroad is that in the third world we were usually looking for somebody who could hold power and suppress the aspirations of the broad people in given countries. And we always justified that in terms of anti-communism. And if we don't have a general in Guatemala City or Seoul, then Kim Il-sung will take over, or somebody, the Soviets will sponsor somebody else. And always that Cold War bipolarity or Cold War distinction and division violated the truth of what was going on in all of these countries. So, we still have a lot of problems. I mean, look at Iran. We're dealing with a country where we overthrew the government in 1953.
Okay.
They still don't like it.
The people's movement in Gwangju, May 1980, this has contributed much to the development of democracy in this society. And how do you see this people's movement uprising in May in Gwangju from the international perspective? There is a way to in South Africa, and there's Gwangju here.
Well, when you look at Korea and China, The March 1st, 1919 movement was very important in touching off the May 4th movement in China. When you look at May 4th, 1919 materials, documents, you see them saying, look what the Koreans did. They rose up against the Japanese. We need to rise up against the imperial powers in China.
You mean the demonstration effect?
The demonstration effect. Much of that was forgotten as the May 4th movement became a kind of touchstone of 20th century politics in China. But it's a fact. And in the case of the Gwangju uprising, 9 years later you had the Tiananmen demonstrations in China. I don't think there's as direct a relationship, but the Chinese were well aware that in the Philippines and in Korea there had been mass movements to overthrow dictatorships, and they had succeeded, and that students were often in the vanguard of that. So I think there was a less direct, but nonetheless demonstration effect in the case of the Tiananmen uprising. I think, though, that Americans, unfortunately, tend to look at the 1980s and what they think of is the democratic movements in Eastern Europe, like Solidarity, which I think shared a lot in common with the democratic movement here, of common people, workers, fighting against a dictatorial regime. But because of the deep anti-communism bred into the American people, they think all the important things happened in Eastern Europe in the 1980s, and then in 1989 something terrible happened in China, and they forget about the Philippines and Korea that were real testimonies to what a democratic movement can achieve.
5월 광주민주항쟁을 통해서 우리는 많은 것을 목격을 했습니다. 특히 광주민주항쟁은 한국의 민주주의 발전뿐만이 아니라 우리와 미국과의 관계를 새롭게 생각하도록 만들었습니다. 브루스 커밍스 교수는 지난 1961년과 그리고 1980년 두 차례에 걸쳐서 미국은 한반도 남쪽의 군사정권을 지지하는 그러한 모습을 보였다. 그래서 두 번에 걸친 여러 가지 비극적인 그런 사태를 가져온 것에 대한 미국의 정책에 대해서 문제를 제기를 했습니다. 뿐만이 아니라 이 과정을 통해서 한국은 미국에 대해서 과연 어떻게 생각할 것인가 하는 새로운 과제와 고민에 빠졌던 것입니다. 이제 저희들은 광주민주항쟁 이후에 한반도 전체를 통해서 민주주의와 그리고 통일에 대한 생각을 새롭게 가담게 되었습니다. 통일에 대한 얘기 나눠보도록 하겠습니다. Bruce, your book, The Origin of the Korean War, you said that the Korean War was officially ended in 1953, but it still continued to exist, still until now. And so you are arguing about how we should end this war system.
Well, of course, the war is continuing because there's never been a peace settlement, and we still have just an armistice. And we have very heavily armed people in the South Korean and North Korean armies, and the U.S. Army still here today. 30,000 American troops are in Korea. This is 62 years after they first landed in 1945. I'm sure no one ever expected that that would happen, that troops would be here 62 years from now. I mean, if you think about Iraq today, if the U.S. is able to stabilize Iraq, does that mean American troops will be in Iraq 60 years from now? The U.S. tends to get into wars and not know how to get out of them.
No exit strategy.
No exit strategy. And once bases are built and America gets committed to a particular place like South Korea, then the Pentagon likes the bases. They're able to train people. They can go abroad. They get another star on their uniform. And people don't pay attention. I was told by people in Washington that when Don Rumsfeld became Secretary of Defense, he was surprised to find out we had 37,000 troops in Korea. Surprised. So, of course, he took about 9,000 of them to Iraq.
Oh, really?
People forget the fact that the U.S. has 730-odd bases around the world.
Forget?
Yeah, they forget or never knew.
Whenever we have a talk about the May Uprising, that issue also involves the question of the perception about the North Korea. how the people perceive the North Korea, how the United States perceive the North Korea, the image of North Korea, that affects so significantly.
Well, I should say that the image of North Korea today in the United States is probably similar to what it was here 30 or 40 years ago, in that North Korea.
No change.
Well, the change in the U.S. is that North Korea has really become demonized. Kim Jong-il is seen as a really crazy figure, very irresponsible and reckless. And that's the kind of thing people used to say about Kim Il-sung, you know, in the 70s here in Korea. The kind of hysterical anti-communism that existed here for so long now exists in the United States, in part because nobody knows anything about North Korea, and it's easy for the media to indulge in this kind of behavior. But it's very unfortunate because North Korea has been changing a lot. South Korea's relationship with the North has changed tremendously. And Americans, I think, you know, including our leaders, are very much behind the times. They still see North Korea through the lenses of the Korean War and the threat of aggression. I do think, though, that the southwest of Korea is so interesting in the last 60 years because, except for Jeju-do, it's the farthest away from North Korea you can get and still be in Korea.
Yeah, still,
still
in
be in
Korea.
Korea.
And yet, this is where you had strong labor and peasant movements in the
Yes.
1940s and a strong civil society in the 1980s and in the uprising. It's very hard to see how the North Koreans can influence people by remote control down here. And in fact, all the documents I saw show that North Koreans were never involved in unrest in South Korea.
Professor Joe, how the people here in Gwangju could mobilize the forces for the reunification movement after Gwangju uprising. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
The main reason for the mobilization of the local people toward the reunification movement strongly was, I guess, as you said, you know, the repression, the military repression of the May 18 uprising was based on the logical grounds that the uprising was more or less associated with impure elements. That means the communist elements and something. So, and the way that we can restore or build democracy has to be connected with the way that we kind of eliminate the structure of division of this nation. So that's kind of popular belief among the activists, democratic activists in this area and also in South Korea again.
Recently, the Bush administration seems to give up the two-front strategy, and the Bush administration seems to change its course. Right, just what you said. He is going to be so closer to your understanding of this Korean policy, and so do you see that? The United States, the Bush administration is so sincere about this change.
Well, I think
Here in this country, are worried about whether
there are critics. There are critics who are worried about that.
Yeah.
I know. It's hard to say whether he's sincere in the absence of much information about why. I've been told that they would get into a room and everybody would argue back and forth about what to do about North Korea, State Department wanting engagement, hardliners wanting regime change, and President Bush would not say, okay, this is the policy. You guys be quiet, here's our policy. So they fought all the time. But then when Bolton left, John Bolton and Wolfowitz left, several other less well-known
Could you see
neocons
that is
left.
kind of a symptom of the weakening neoconservative forces in his administration?
Neoconservatives are completely
Lost
power. Their power. They can't buy a cup of coffee at Starbucks even if they have $1.50. I mean, they are completely powerless now. And President Bush has got a pile of problems in his lap, thanks to the neoconservatives plus, Dick Cheney.
So that is why the Bush changed his mind, or
I don't know. I don't know. As I said earlier, I think there hasn't been any reporting that I'm aware of that is really good on this subject. But you can look at Iraq and see how bogged down the U.S. is in Iraq and realize that it doesn't have any combat brigades to spare for Korea, so a military solution is out. And if a military solution is out, then maybe we can get a diplomatic agreement.
Bush has said many times the U.S. is ready to establish the peace system here in the Korean Peninsula. Could we believe that?
Well, I don't believe it because I don't think President Bush has any experience with the Korean problem. And I think Dick Cheney is the primary foreign policy maker in the administration. And Dick Cheney is the kind of guy that would have supported Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan. So I think the mystery of the February agreement is how this happened while Dick Cheney is still vice president. Establishing a peace system here is something that President Bush could do if he listened to former President Kim Dae-jung. In other words, reconciliation, an end to the Korean War, confidence-building measures, reductions of forces along the DMZ, all of these things are necessary to establish a peace regime. I do have some hope that the six-party talks might be a venue or a modality for transnational diplomacy in Northeast Asia.
What would you like to recommend the Korean policymakers and Korean people in order to do? I mean, in order to facilitate the reconciliation between South and North Korea and to overcome the crisis?
Well, I think Korean leaders have been way out front on this issue in arguing for diplomacy, for multilateral, many-sided diplomacy in Northeast Asia, for a Northeast Asian, some sort of diplomatic venue that will include the nations of Northeast Asia. Korea has a deep relationship with China that has gone on in spite of the very different systems here and there. And I think on North Korea, since Kim Dae-jung was inaugurated in 1998, South Korea has been out front on that issue too. I really think former President Kim Dae-jung really deserves a lot of credit for a policy of peaceful coexistence, of reconciliation, of a peace regime, ending the Korean War, and really allowing South Koreans to get to know North Koreans again. To me, as a foreigner, it's just an enormous sea change in the past 10 years, in that I think many South Koreans now realize that the people across the border are their brothers.
Yes, Bruce, we are approaching a closing moment right now. So, year 2010 will be the 30th anniversary of the May Uprising, the Gwangju May Uprising. And many things will happen. That is a kind of a uncharted future for us. So could you tell us about, that the democracy, the reunification, globalization, many issues we have right now. So could you, do you have anything to say to Gwangju people here? Yes.
Well, I'd like to say that it's a deep honor for me to be asked to speak at the 27th commemoration.
Yes.
And also, as I said earlier, to receive an award for my scholarship in the name of Kim Dae-jung. I am a scholar of Korea, but I'm also just a foreigner, and I have always tried to stay away from telling Koreans what to do. My criticism has almost always been directed at my own government, but it seems to me that Gwangju is very well established as a democratic city, growing very rapidly. And at least in Gwangju, people seem to have begun to come to terms with what happened in 1980 with the beautiful ceremonies and pageantry that I saw on Thursday evening. And the President Roh Moo-hyun coming here for the commemoration, President Kim Dae-jung having been the first president in 1998 to visit the graves of the people who lost their lives here. All of this is, I think, extremely gratifying because it suggests that 1980 was a premature victory rather than an abject defeat. In other words, the victory came later, as Professor Naganche and others have said at Jeonnam University. The victory came only 15 years later, 20 years later, but it came. And I don't see anything happening in the next 3 years that's going to change that situation. I do hope, though, that really in the near decade or so, the next 10 years, that North and South Korea can move more deeply on the path of reconciliation and even begin to talk about reunification.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cho, and thank you, Professor
Thank you.
Bruce
Thank you very
Cummings.
much. Thank you.
네, 브루스 커밍스와의 대담. 이제 2010년이면은 광주 5월 민중항쟁이 30주년이 됩니다. 저들은 이제 광주의 지난 세월과 그리고 현재 뿐만이 아니라 민주주의와 통일을 위해서 어떤 고민을 해야 할 것인지에 대한 이야기를 나눠보았습니다. 한국전쟁의 기원을 통해서 한국 역사의 새로운 면모를 조명한 브루스 커밍스 교수와의 대담을 통해서 우리들은 이제 우리가 어떠한 역사적 위치에 놓였었는지 또 앞으로는 어떠한 길을 가야 할 것인지에 대한 생각을 나눠보았습니다. 27전을 맞이한 광주 5월 항쟁, 이제 많은 과제를 또 숙제를 우리들에게 던지고 있습니다. 역시 단지 광주에서만 국한되는 사안이 아니고 우리 민족 전체에게 새로운 성찰과 그 새로운 열정을 불어넣을 수 있는 그러한 소중한 출발점이 될 것입니다. 브루스 커밍스 교수와의 대담을 통해서 우리들은 또한 새로운 희망도 함께 읽을 수 있었습니다. 이 희망, 우리 모두의 크나큰 자산이 될 수 있기를 바랍니다. 고맙습니다.